G7 summit, which was just concluded in Hiroshima, Japan, made it absolutely clear that the G7 leaders, led by the US, the British, and the NATO officials, intend to maintain a commitment to permanent war against Russia. There's no mistaking that conclusion from looking at the comments, the statements they put out, the press statements, and so on, that what we see is that the decision to continue the war has been made. Now, consider the context for this. As they were meeting, there was the imminent fall of Bakhmut, which had been made as a last stand attempt by Zelensky to prove that the Ukrainians will continue to fight and fight effectively against the Russians, no matter what the losses are to Ukraine. And the losses were quite extensive. Secondly, you have the growing push for a negotiated settlement, the organizing going on by President Xi of China, of Lula from Brazil, of the Vatican, of African leaders, all of them saying, end the war, negotiate, let's get a settlement. And this is in the context of the fact that had this happened, had there been negotiations initially, there never would have been a war. Had the security interests of Russia and Ukraine been considered by the West, Putin would have never launched the special military operation. But again, they made clear no negotiations. And then, of course, the other part of this context is the failure of the sanctions that have been imposed against Russia to weaken Russia. Instead, the Russian economy continues. It's had some damage, but the bigger damage is to the countries of Western Europe, as you've had a backfire effect from the sanctions, including on energy policy, inflation, and so on. So the leaders in their communiques made clear they are prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian. Now, what did they do at the summit? Well, they had the puppet hero of Ukraine, Zelensky, there to give them a pep talk, to talk about how grateful the Ukrainians are, and especially how happy they are with the work of the British. He said they will continue to fight, they will never give up, they will never accept negotiations, which is exactly what the NATO leaders wanted to hear. At the same time, he continued his global panhandling, demanding more money and more weapons. And of course, the Brits are in the lead on this, but the US is also, in terms of the amount of money and aid, the United States is the leader, but the British are the ones who pushed the envelope, which came up again in the demands for not just training for F-16 fighters, but the delivery of F-16 fighters. And then the second front was on the agenda, the second front being China. It's clear that, again, from Europe, they're following the lead of the United States of talking about using Taiwan as the issue to confront China. And even though the West is in a very poor position vis-a-vis China, they're going ahead for a full second front. They denounced China for economic coercion. Now this is really rich. Here you have one sanction after another issued from especially the United States and the British. That's economic coercion. And yet China, which is conducting a policy of extended economic development, investment, and trade with all of its neighbors, is being accused of economic coercion. Now, also, there's discussion to upgrade the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US nuclear submarine agreement. And the Japanese have made it clear they're going to rearm and do this in conjunction, especially with a special relationship with the British, which, by the way, historically goes back to World War I, pre-World War I, where Japan was built up by the British to fight a war against Russia in 1904 and 1905, which weakened Russia significantly at that time. So one final note, by the way, to do this at a summit in Hiroshima, the city that was the first city struck by a nuclear bomb on August 6th, 1945, which killed between 130 and 160,000 people. To plot an extended war in Hiroshima shows an absolute disdain for Western war crimes, and at the same time is meant to send a message to Russia, because the first atom bomb attack on Japan by Harry Truman was meant to show the Russians that we have nuclear weapons and will use them. This, at that point, Stalin and the Soviets, that the US has nuclear weapons and will use them unless the Soviets stay out of Asia. So the question that emerges from this is, why did they take this direction? What is the goal of the Western powers? Now, we have the justification that was given recently by the newly coronated King Charles, the man who wears a crown that's too big for his head. But Charles was in Berlin, and what did he say the issues are? He said, economic security, protecting economic security, and our democratic values. That's what's at stake. Now, let's just take a quick look at that. Defending Ukrainian democracy. There's no democracy. Zelensky has shut down all opposition papers, all opposition political parties. They have a kill list for people who say the wrong things about Ukraine. To say that this is democracy, they're attacking the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, saying that it has Russian ties. Well, that's obviously a joke to talk about Ukrainian democracy. How about Ukrainian sovereignty? Well, where was Ukrainian sovereignty in February 2014, when under the direction of Obama, Biden, and Victoria Nuland, the Maidan coup was organized after a several-year process to overturn a democratically elected government, the Yanukovych government. Where was sovereignty then? Now, the Maidan operation was a regime change coup to prepare Ukraine precisely for this proxy war against Russia. And if you're going to talk about concern for sovereignty, what about the US troops that are still in Syria? They're holding nearly 1/3 of the territory of Syria. They were never invited there. They're supposedly conducting a war on terror, when in fact there's great evidence that shows that it was US forces, including the CIA and mercenary forces, that armed and trained Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the very terrorists they say they're there to protect the country from. And while they're there, they're stealing the oil and some of the best farmland in Syria. So where's the regard for sovereignty? Well, how about protecting economic prosperity, economic security? Well, if you want to do that, don't send in the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund, going back to the 1991 fall of the Soviet Union, has been at the forefront of the looting process that's lowered the standard of living year after year after year in Ukraine. And after the 2014 coup, they've continued to lower the standard of living in Ukraine. And now you have BlackRock and Vanguard and other grain cartels coming in on the back end of the IMF, of the so-called privatization. And who knows how much money Zelensky is getting in the profit from the purchase of land and so on. So economic prosperity, forget it. Now, what about this question of you're not allowed to redraw borders? Have they forgotten about Yugoslavia? Have they forgotten about the war in the 90s that was conducted by NATO against Serbia? Well, that redrew the borders. So virtually every argument for staying there is a fraud. So what are we looking at here? Well, what is the real intent? Let's start with the statement from the Secretary of Defense from Raytheon, General Lloyd Austin, when he spoke at the first Ramstein meeting to provide weapons to the Ukrainians. What did he say? We need to weaken Russia, to degrade their military. The idea is to make Russia not a great power anymore, that it can't stand up against the West. And that was the intention of not negotiating from the period of 2008 until February 2022, despite multiple attempts by Putin to raise legitimate security concerns for the people in the Donbass and Ukraine generally. Second, is the idea of breaking Russia apart to finish the job that was started with the shock therapy program in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union, which for a decade lowered the standard of living, led to an incredible flow of wealth and raw materials out of Russia to the West, conducted largely by British and American bankers. And that would be continued if they succeeded in overturning the Putin government, which is one of the next parts of their intention. The regime change in Russia, which Biden himself stammered, it flowed out of his mouth in a speech in Poland when he said, for God's sake, this man has to go, referring to Putin. So the idea of degrading the military, breaking it up and getting rid of Putin, putting him on trial for war crimes. Again, there's a certain rich hypocrisy in that, given what the United States did in Libya, in Iraq, Afghanistan, in Yemen, and so on, which has cost millions of lives. And yet there are no war crime tribunals for the Bushes and Cheneys and Obamas and Susan Rice and others. Now, finally, what is important to note about this regime change question is that its ultimate goal is classic British geopolitics, which is to prevent the prospect of an alliance between Western European nations, Eastern European nations, and Russia. This goes back to geopolitics and Halford Mackinder in 1904, but it's been a constant of British politics since the middle of the 19th century with the Great Game against Russia and the Palmerston policy, to destroy sovereign nations so they would not pose a threat to the continued control of the empire based in the City of London. And so this is the ultimate goal, to weaken Russia so that there can be no alternative to what the Biden and Blinken and others call the rules-based order, or more properly termed the unipolar order. Now, if it's not possible to win this war and bring Putin to trial, what other option do they have? And that's the topic of the discussion in our Manhattan Project today. What's the option? Assassination. And this was made clear by statements coming from the Military Intelligence Directorate of the Ukrainian Defense Department, the so-called GUR. The head of the GUR made a statement, Budanov, said that the Ukrainians have the right to assassinate Russians anywhere, including after the war is over, defining the Russians as an enemy. This goes back to the British line from people like Keir Giles and others, that Russia is genetic, and also it was the statement from one of the leading Americans, I'm forgetting who it was now, maybe it was Rumsfeld, or in any case, that Russia is inherently an enemy of democracy. It's a genetic problem, and that therefore the West has to stand up against it. And so Budanov, in talking about assassinating Russians anywhere, is reasserting that. But then you have the deputy head of the GUR, Skibitsky, who said, Putin is on our kill list, a threat to assassinate the president of Russia. Now, don't forget, there was a drone attack on the Kremlin on May 3rd that could have been a targeting of Putin, or at least testing the security around him. Now, the use of assassination through war has been has gone on in the last 20 years, going back to the Iraq War, which led to the judicial murder of Saddam Hussein, Libya, in which Gaddafi was killed. And what was the idea there? These were two leaders who refused to submit to the rules-based order, who asserted their sovereign right to develop their nations and to work with other countries to form an alliance. In the case of Gaddafi, who talked about an African Union that would have a new currency that would go into investment in development. So these targeted assassinations have taken place before. And you see that in terms of what happened in the United States, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. You see it in terms of France, the attempts against de Gaulle, the assassination in 1961 of Patrice Lumumba, over and over and over, assassination as a weapon of regime change. And we see that the Ukrainians are serious about this because they're deploying neo-Nazi hit squads across the border into Russia, as they did on May 22nd at Belgrade. So in this context, the US economy is in trouble. The dollar system is facing an enormous attack. And it's not an attack on the American people, it's an attack on the banks, the global corporate cartels that are dictating this military policy, this regime change policy. And as a result, we're seeing a move toward a new financial system. And not surprisingly, the sovereign nations of Russia and China are at the center of that. Now, given what happened to John F. Kennedy and the statements coming from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's demanding a reopening of the investigation into the Kennedy assassination, and he says it was the CIA that did it, this is an ideal opportunity to have a full open discussion of the use of assassination as a weapon of politics. But there are two parts to this. One, bring forth the truth. Who can use assassination and why? And the whole picture must be presented. But secondly, it's not just about the United States and the John F. Kennedy assassination. You have to take a look at the International Assassination Bureau as we are in our deliberations today. And so I think it's important that this discussion process that was initiated by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. actually coheres with what the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization have been raising over many, many years, going back to the 70s and the attempts to assassinate Lyndon LaRouche and the use of the so-called permanent bureaucracy or deep state to target LaRouche as an enemy of this globalist cartels. So we have an opportunity today, and it has to be to take the broadest approach, because if we do this right, we can remove power from the hands of those who use assassination as a weapon, use regime change as a way of extending their corrupt control of the world economy. And this is now up to you to join us in this mobilization to make sure this happens. And that's what I wanted to say today.
Welcome to the International Connection. Today we continue our conversation with Lyndon LaRouche from his jail cell in Alexandria, Virginia.
The point is, was Kennedy killed because he was John F. Kennedy, or was President Kennedy killed because he was president?
That's the problem.
And that's right, and I lean to the second one.
Because he was the president.
That's right. He happened to have the misfortune of being the president at the time, which is the primary reason for it.
So there were forces. I mean, Kennedy even said there was a government behind his back. There was this group behind him that was orchestrating a lot of these crises.
It was essentially, it's not unknown who they are.
Well, the Rockefellers, would they be part of them?
So I think the Rockefellers, that's where I would get off Peter a bit on, with my own view, is that I think that's exaggerated. Yes, the Rockefeller interest is very specific. I know the thing. I've done a lot in exposing it. David Rockefeller is certainly no friend of mine.
Yes.
But I think that misses the point because it makes it too narrow and makes it too linear.
Right. In other words, it's the idea of the Fondi is a group of associates.
There's a social formation to the effect that no one individual or no one individual group determines the group. It's the inner within the group that determines what the group does.
Right, and that's why they can't put the finger on who killed Kennedy, those kind of things. They can't.
More than that, I think it was the problem is more than that. When you organize an assassination of that type for the President of the United States, a conspiracy which operated on the scale of which that thing operated. Remember, the killing of Kennedy enveloped and overlaid efforts to assassinate Charles de Gaulle.
Yes.
The same operation, in effect.
Yep.
So it's a vast conspiracy. Then when you get a vast conspiracy, what makes the conspiracy work is a lot of deception within the conspiracy and a lot of exploitation of the particular motivation of people who are drawn into playing particular roles. So that if you interrogate somebody and say who pulled a trigger and say, why was the President of the United States killed? Why'd you shoot him? This fellow might have a motive. He might simply say, because I was paid to do so.
Yes.
Or somebody else might explain a motive. That might have been the motive for their behavior or the induced motive. That doesn't mean that's why the thing happened. So that it comes to a question, the people who planned this, and this was, I don't think I should name it on the air,
Yes.
but the people who planned this were functioning at a very high level. So they knew what they were doing, unlike people on a lower level who may not have known fully what they were doing, apart
Right.
from the killing. And even some didn't know they were involved in the killing.
Say that
They
again?
knew that they were destabilizing the institution of the presidency of the United States.
You just said those people in the low levels didn't know what they were
Didn't know the full implications of what
they were doing.
They knew what they were doing, but they didn't know what somebody else intended this to lead to.
Yes.
And what they were doing was destabilizing, particularly with a cover-up, the Warren Commission cover-up. The combination of the assassination with the cover-up actually did destabilize the United States, destabilize the institutions of government of the United States, destroyed the presidency as an efficient instrument of government, as a constitutional instrument. And the fellows who organized this thing at that level knew they were doing this. So therefore, I say, if they weren't out to kill Kennedy, though somebody may have come up with motives for killing John F. Kennedy, they were out to kill President Kennedy because he was president.
The institution.
The institution.
Okay, so I'd just like to get your reactions to that. Jacques, I'm going to go to you first because Lynn describes the idea of the overlay of the de Gaulle assassination attempts upon the Kennedy situation. And I'm certain that people don't, certainly not in the United States, don't have much of a feel for that at all. But besides that particular, which I wanted to bring up, just your overall response to how you think Lynn's answer covered this matter.
Well, first, as an old man, I have a lot of things to say on that to rejuvenate world politics today. What we are dealing with is that what you said, Dennis, is the International Assassination Bureau, the physical elimination branch of the financial oligarchy, the lower mafia, the underworld, acting not necessarily consciously on behalf of the upper mafia. Kennedy's assassination and all the others' attempts against de Gaulle exemplify the international character of what some call the firm, others the fondy, others the synarchy. It's exactly that. And on that, I have two things to say. I don't know if I will go directly into it now.
Okay, very good. Cliff?
Well, I think Lynn hit the nail on the head in his making a distinction between the person, John F. Kennedy, and the president, the presidency, the president, Kennedy. And I agree that it was an attack on the president of the United States, just like the de Gaulle attempted assassination against the president of France. Now, we could look at the de Gaulle supported sovereignty, sovereign states. He wanted a cooperative grouping of European states, but based on a sovereignty type of a agreement. Kennedy also represented a sovereign United States and had concerns about the bureaucracy getting us into the Vietnam War and many other issues. The Treasury Department getting rid of the certain types of currency, etc. So the assassination of President Kennedy, of course, in American history is not unprecedented. You had obviously the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, McKinley, and so on. So there have been assassinations throughout our American history, and therefore the assassination of President Kennedy should not be considered something that has not happened in the past or something that can be simply dismissed, that some lunatic did it, et cetera, et cetera. There was obviously a very well-planned conspiracy of some kind behind that assassination, and that's exactly the point that Lynn is making, and also Jacques just pointed out. Lynn's point was that the lower level mafioso underworld types that might have been involved, Ruby and those guys, that's the underworld. But what we're dealing with is the globalists in the what we can call the overworld. So the globalists who are plotting these assassinations, and also, the Archduke Ferdinand, who was murdered and triggered off in Sarajevo, that triggered off World War I. There are political assassinations. So you have the overworld, and then you have the underworld mafia, and they coordinate. They work together. Bill Casey's brother, his office was in Las Vegas, for example. So I agree with what Lynn said and what Jacques said, and I think it's a very fundamental point that it was an assassination of the President of the United States as an institution to destroy political order here in the United States.
I have.
Yeah. So, Jacques, let me just ask you to do one thing for us. Can you paint a picture for us for a minute of what 1960 was in terms of not just the United States and de Gaulle, but also what was the political configuration of forces that we're looking at? The Central Intelligence Agency has been created in 1947, coming off the OSS and so on. But there have been many things that have happened in France that de Gaulle is involved in. Of course, when we talk about Vietnam, which would seem to be the immediate issue, but of course that had been the French, then the United States, of course, taking over from them, apparently. But there's also the role of British intelligence, British military interests, and so on in that area. So please give us kind of a way of thinking about what the atmosphere is of that time when Kennedy comes into office.
Well, I think first I have to be specific on how this thing worked. First, we have to look at the picture of Jack Kennedy, informed about Lumumba's murder. It was on January 17, 1961, and it's sorrow and horror. Sorrow because Kennedy genuinely considered Patrick Lumumba as a great statesman, and horror because he understood then, he had already doubts about it, but he understood then that the US Secret Services, the Anglo-American Secret Services, I should say, could kill a president without the approval and even knowledge of the past president, Eisenhower, and of the incoming one, he himself, Kennedy. Then look at a picture of Jack's funeral. Bob and his brother, the two of them, are there. And de Gaulle is very close in the background. Somebody is not there, it's Lyndon Johnson. And de Gaulle is attending Kennedy's funeral. He immediately jumped in a plane and went to attend Kennedy's funeral in Washington. Now let's go back to November 27, 1963. De Gaulle is back in Paris. He meets Alain Perfit, his kind of confident and favorite young minister, the same that forecasted that China would be key in the following years in the world. So what de Gaulle tells Perfit, who asks him, what is all that about? What should we say on that? And de Gaulle said, Kennedy, that he said a bit later, but I think it should be quoted now, and then I would tell you what he said to Perfit. De Gaulle said, Kennedy died as a soldier under fire, doing his duty in the service of his country. In the name of the French people, a friend always of the American people, I salute this great example and this great memory. And he said the American people, he did not say the American government. So then what de Gaulle told Perfit, Alain Perfit, the police were in on the job. Either they ordered it or to be done, or else they allowed it to be done. In any case, they are in on the job. Then it's commented in the Washington Post, October 19, 1961, so it's known. In his refusal to believe that Kennedy assassination could have been the work of a lone fanatic, de Gaulle compared it to the assassination attempts against himself in France. Then let's now hear de Gaulle speaking. It looks like a cowboy, an Indian story, he said, but it's really only an OAS story. The OAS, or Secret Army Organization, was a terrorist group which fought to keep Algeria French. And it's the same that we know was connected in Kennedy's assassination. Garrison explained it. So for the general, Lee Harvey Oswald was only an unfortunate frontman designated in advance as a scapegoat to set off an anti-communist witch hunt to distract attention. An anti-communist witch hunt to distract attention. Then about Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby, this is what he had to say. A trial had to be avoided at all costs. Things might have come out. So the police got hold of an informer, someone they had where they wanted him. That guy killed the false assassin on the pretext of defending Kennedy's memory. What a laugh, concluded de Gaulle. Every police in the world is alike when it comes to the dirty work. Every police in the world is alike when it comes to the dirty work. The truth, added de Gaulle, is never going to be known because it is a state secret. If it would be known, it would be the end of the United States. That's plainly what de Gaulle meant, United States as they were, not the United States as they should be. So he added, and this was quoted recently, he added, and it has only recently been known, America is in danger of upheavals, but you will see all of them together would observe the law of silence. They would close ranks. They will do everything to stifle any scandal. They would throw Noah's cloak over these shameful deeds in order to not lose face in front of the whole world, in order to not risk unleashing riots in the United States, in order to preserve the Union and to avoid a new civil war, in order to not ask themselves questions they don't want to know, they don't want to find out, they won't allow themselves to find out. And then Alan Dulles did what he was supposed to do.
All right, Cliff, you want to respond? You have any response to any of this, Cliff?
Well, sure. The atmosphere I recall back then, I was in high school. I was a freshman in high school, first-year student, and I remember the assassination very well because I was in class. There was a knock on the door opens, the teacher goes out into the corridor and comes back into our class like white in the face, and says the president has just been shot. And we were all totally stunned by that. And the teacher was a pretty tough guy. He was a football coach. So, but everybody was very shaken up that morning. And then later we found out the president had died actually from his wounds. The atmosphere internationally, of course, was the so-called Cold War, which was in a way kind of a fake conflict, bloc politics, the so-called West versus the so-called communist East, and the Western bloc versus the nasty communist bloc run by the Soviet Union. And you had the division of Europe, et cetera, resulting from World War II, Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So we had the two blocs. Back in the 50s, there were all these nuclear war scares, and people would have in their basement food supply for a few months in case of a nuclear war. And school children would have little exercises in class, how to duck under your desk in case of a nuclear war, and so on. So the atmosphere back then was really horrible. And aside from the Cold War atmosphere, you had the beginnings of, as Jacques mentioned, the Vietnam War situation, which apparently Kennedy wanted to get us out of. So you had, and that of course was in the context of this struggle against communism, et cetera, et cetera. So that was sort of the political atmosphere at one level, at kind of a mid-level political atmosphere in the United States and in the world. But actually what was going on is even at a higher level. The globalists, what we would call today the globalists, back then you used to talk about high finance, haute finance. And so you had that high political level that was operating, that de Gaulle was, that Jacques mentioned de Gaulle was pointing out that there was a higher level of, at the international level, concerned about, essentially, I think, leaders of countries who wanted their country to have sovereignty, as opposed to being controlled by the globalists one way or another. So I think that, to me, is a very key aspect here. Kennedy, de Gaulle, Jacques mentioned Lumumba, who was for sovereignty for his country. So what we see at this high level, international level of powerful people in various groups. It's not just one group, it's various groups that have common interest. They don't want sovereign countries. They want to be in control and control countries. So I would say that's, to me, the ultimate reason Kennedy was killed. He was a president of a country and he wanted it to be sovereign and not under the control of the military industrial complex, which is simply a tool of the higher level haute finance or high finance or the synarchie, the synarchy, etc. So that's how I look at it.
Well, now that you brought something up there, Cliff, I'm going to have to, I think, ask Jacques to do something for us, because you said, well, he was killed because he was a president of a country that wanted sovereignty. But there's a difference in terms of the United States presidential system and the French presidential system as well, and many other nations. Jacques, a long time ago, know that Lynn wrote a book, an extensive book, never published in English, actually, to the best of my recollection, called France After Charles de Gaulle. And you were involved in the writing of that book as well. You've also run for president in France, and have had conversations with Lynn, many of them, about what a president is. So this is significant because often, particularly in the United States today, people say, well, presidents don't really have power because the real power is the corporations, or the real power is the CIA or something like that. So I just wanted to get Jacques, ask you to say a bit to us about this, what the conception of the presidency is people should have, so that they understand what Lynn means by that, what was being implemented, what was actually the practice of the presidency under de Gaulle, which is different than it has been in other people in France, for example, and so on.
So about sovereignty, I should quote Georges Boris. Georges Boris was the advisor to the Free French in London, and then a close friend to Pierre Mendès France, who never worked with de Gaulle, but the two of them had the same impulse for true sovereignty. There is a lot of fake sovereignty around today. So what Georges Boris said is, if the state doesn't control the money, it's the money that controls the state. So both de Gaulle and Kennedy had in common the decision to control the issuance of money and credit. So Kennedy he was studying how to control the Federal Reserve. And de Gaulle wanted to control la Banque de France. And in 1968, for example, he was the leader of the only country in the West who refused to refused to stop transforming gold into dollars. He wanted to maintain the connection between gold and dollar. This means that in his own way, he wanted this sovereignty to be exerted in the key financial area. It's very interesting that today, one banker who is 93 years old who is not basically, he doesn't think like we think. But he says it's clear that today, contrary to this period, it's the financiers that control the world, in his words. It's his words. It's a financial oligarchy that control all Western governments, and this is something we have to change, but it may be bloody. So we don't, of course, want it to be bloody, but it has to be changed. So it's our mission to organize the populations to reestablish the very institution of the presidency, both in France and in the United States, because Macron in France is no better than Joe Biden. He changes according to the pressures he submitted to, and he accepts those pressures, who is becoming today a crime, because he is in a state of submission when he should be in a state of exerting his political will as a president. So you have basically the same thing, and it's our responsibility, both in France and the United States, to reveal publicly and with all the existing proofs, with all that has to be being public, what happened exactly in Dallas and what happened before in Congo and why they tried to do against de Gaulle, because they wanted a new architecture, a new financial architecture that were not as clear as us in El Gazette-Larouche 10 principles and what Lynn had said many times before, but they had this impulse to go there. And this was something that the oligarchy and the services accomplishing the directly or indirectly what the oligarchy wanted to be accomplished, the physical murder branch of the oligarchy, the underworld, and they had all these murders in the United States and in France. It was just 3 or 4 murders also of people of lesser importance than the United States, but ministers and people who had responsibilities in international negotiations. So not only is our duty, I think, in this circumstance to say the truth, but for the sake of the future of humanity and of Europe, of France, and of United States, to free the populations from the shackles of this financial oligarchy. And our Western nations are occupied by this mafia, and to bring peace to the world needs to get rid of them. What Dennis Small, our friend Dennis Small, said is very, I don't know if he's only one that said, but many of you said it, is very true. The de-dollarization, which is to prevent the control of the dollar by this financial oligarchy, is good for the world, but it's also good for the Americans, for the United States as a nation, and for the American population. And I think it's interesting in terms of the debate in Europe. Should we stick to the euro, or should we go back to national monies? The euro is a branch, in fact, a same branch. One is the key branch is the dollar, the second branch is the euro, of these Western occupied countries by what you may call the Anglosphere, but in fact it is financial oligarchy, and there are people, as Lynn said many times, who are members of this financial oligarchy and are neither British nor Americans. So this thing is controlling our nations, and we should free our nations. And I think this is the key message. And from this, what we have to learn from this moment, and what people have to learn, what they try to cover up now, Kennedy's murder, saying that it was a mafia, it was various forces, and it was not clear who murdered it, and so on and so forth. Well, I have something to say. Speaking about Lumumba and Congo, Kennedy was accused to want to sold out Congo to the communists. That was one of the accusations, because in Congo, there was uranium, and Kennedy was accused to be a commie. I have this thing here, which I think is very interesting. It was distributed in Dallas 3 days before Kennedy's assassination. And what it says is there are 7 points, and the 6 points, the most interesting, says he accuses Kennedy, wanted for treason, He was consistently appointing anti-Christians to federal office, upholds the Supreme Court in its anti-Christian rulings. Aliens and non-communists abound in federal offices. So this accusation is exactly what was said against de Gaulle. He wants to give independence to Algeria, he's with the commies, and he's a bad guy, and you should get rid of him. So this locates what's happening in that period, but also what's happening right now in terms of the proxy war in Ukraine. We should speak about that at a later moment, and probably in another meeting or another discussion. But it's key to the Kennedys and murder and de Gaulle's murder attempts. It's here and now. It's not something remote in the past.
Cliff, let me ask you, given this discussion that reference that Jacques just made about the relationship between money and a presidency or money and an executive, what's your view of how that played out in the case of the Kennedy assassination, or what kind of role that had? Further, you've talked often about this idea of the financial synarchy, and I'm not sure that that's so clear for Americans in particular as to what that means. Might not be clear for others as well. So you have any comments about this matter?
Sure. Dennis and Jacques, I'll start with Jacques' point, which goes right to the heart of the matter. Jacques pointed out that the banking circles, the high-level banking circles, haute finance, are a considerable part, if not the dominant part, of the globalists who could also be heads of big corporations, important corporations, et cetera, et cetera. So you have, Jacques really helped us by pointing out that when we're looking at who they are, the globalists, we need to look first and foremost at high finance. We need to remember that finance should serve industry rather than the opposite, industry being the slave of finance. But so moving from that, we can look at the development of international banking in the 19th century and then into the 20th century and now 21st. And as Jacques pointed out, there's in Europe, there are various financial centers, Paris and London and Frankfurt, etc., are the traditional. Pardon?
Paris now.
Yeah, Paris are the traditional centers. I just thought for Jacques, for all, there were, I'm a Francophile, so I enjoy traveling in France and reading books by French folks. Here's a book, Henri Coston, L'Europe des banquiers. Of course, he was a controversial figure, but I met Coston once at a book fair, elderly gentleman, a nice fellow, elderly old fellow, selling his books at the book fair when I actually was helping my friend sell one of our books at the same book fair. And so the Europe of the bankers, America of the bankers, and of course, we know from American history that, for example, in the late 19th century, the populist movement was against the banking interest in New York, the New York bankers. And the American South and the American West, Chicago and West, were one kind of economic bloc which didn't want to be taken over completely by the New York-controlled economic banking center. So there was competition between New York and Chicago in terms of banking centers back in the old days, before World War II, World War I. So this issue of banks and high finance is key. Now, the synarchy is something kind of simple to explain. It's a club. In the late 19th century, a French fellow, Saint-Yves Delvedre, decided, he was an occultist and kind of a mystic person, and he created this idea of synarchy. That's the opposite of what he called anarchy. So anarchy is disorder, anarchy. But Synarchy is order, order. And this concept was brought forth in some of his books in the 1880s, 1890s, and they crept into intellectual circles on the continent and in England in the early 1900s, late 1800s, 1884, 5, and on. The connection between Saint-Yves d'Elvedre, who was French, and the British, I'm told, ran through the Fabian Society in England and the certain circles associated with the Fabian Society, kind of like a Theosophical Society and other occult groups. So this idea of order, a new order in Europe, sound familiar? Mussolini and Hitler. This idea of order, synarchy, was formed into a club, we can say, of people, important people in France and in the continent, on the continent, in Europe. And as I said, we had the circles in England as well. So the synarchy is a club of high-level banking and business people. They do not regard the world in terms of sovereign states. They regard the world in terms of roughly regions, areas that they can exercise control over. And so sovereign states are their main enemy, because if they're interested in controlling regions, take Lumumba, take the Congo, Belgian Congo, not just uranium, but look at all the other minerals there. Africa is minerals. Therefore, it's a region to be controlled. We have to control Africa because of the minerals and our mining interests. Well, look at Peru today, what just happened there. American mining interests. So keeping our eyes focused on this globalist idea, Jacques pointing out the high finance, the banking interests and the banking centers, and then President Kennedy and President de Gaulle, very interestingly and importantly, were focusing on the banking problem, the financial issues, the high finance issues. So we could posit that certainly these very high financial circles, as opposed with other industrial circles, were involved at the top level in these assassination attempts of de Gaulle, and then multiple, and then the successful assassination attempt against Kennedy. So in conclusion, I would say that we focus on the banking interest in particular, the Federal Reserve, the city in London, Paris, Frankfurt, the key financial centers, and the top people who own the banks. Who own the banks? Who are the top financiers? Who are the Europe des Banquiers? Who are these people? And we can get a little idea if we look at things like the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, the Circle Group. These are clubs of very high-level businessmen, bankers and industrialists, as well as others. So when we're trying to focus on this, I'm a political scientist. We would speak in terms of various types of transnational elites. If you're a political sociologist, you really get into the study of transnational elites. So this is an area of academic study, and there are some experts out there and very interesting papers about transnational elites. So the point I'm making here is we're not engaging in talking about conspiracy theory here. What we're engaging in is analysis from a political science or a political sociology or an economic history perspective. This is not just speculation on any of our parts.
What I want to do, there's several, we have to definitely cover the matter of Vietnam in our discussion, but I would like us to look at another short video, which is Robert Kennedy Jr. describing his reaction to the assassination of his uncle.
Democratic presidential candidate RFK Jr. had some interesting remarks about potential government conspiracies involved in deaths in his own family, making these remarks on Sean Hannity's show the other night. Let's watch.
The day that my uncle was killed, I was picked up at Sidwell Friends School and brought home. The first phone call that my father made after J. Edgar Hoover told him that his brother had been shot was to the CIA desk officer in Langley, who was only a mile from our house.
Yeah.
And my father said to him, "Did your people do this?" His next call was to Harry Ruiz, who was one of the Cuban Bay of Pigs leaders who had remained very, very close to our family and to my father. My father asked him the same question. Then my father called John McComb, who was the head of the CIA, and asked him to come to the house. McComb came over, and when I came home from Sidwell Friends School, my father was walking in the yard with John McComb, and my father was posing the same question to him. Was it our people who did this to my brother? So it was my father's first instinct that the agency had killed his brother.
We could spend a whole...
That is a fascinating escalation of some statements he's been making recently, speaking specifically to his personal experience of seeing his father kind of react and process to the news of his brother's assassination. Certainly lends, in my eyes, some credibility to this argument that he's been making. How do you think this is going to go over?
Certainly, the idea that
Yeah, so that was on recently American television. Cliff, let me just ask you first a question. Could you tell us how, if you happen to know, how many heads of the CIA were bankers? I believe it's the case that 6 out of the first 7 were bankers. Is that the case?
Well, there's always been a close association since World War II, when the OSS and then later the CIA, with Wall Street. There's always been a close association with Wall Street, the banking, investment banking, commercial bank, all that. So we take a look at, and another thing I'd point out is the law firms. The New York law firms are very powerful and part of that elite network. So elite lawyers, of course, assist the elite bankers and businessmen in their international transactions. I would like to point out, Dennis, that Allen Dulles himself, I believe, was a lawyer, and I think the Dulles brothers were associated with the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm in New York, a very powerful, influential, elite white shoe law firm in New York City. Now, I would also point out that Allen Dulles, during the World War II era, was stationed in Bern, Switzerland, for the OSS operation. So Allen Dulles had very high-level contacts with European elites of various kinds, banking and business, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that ran after World War II for a lot of people like Allen Dulles. It ran into the whole Wall Street community, and that top-level Wall Street people and lawyers having international connections with folks in France and England and Germany and well, Japan and around the world. So that's this elite globalist network that we're referring to. So in answer to your question about the CIA and high finance and banking, there's always been a close connection since the days of the OSS. Remember, the fellow that headed up the OSS himself was a Wall Street lawyer back in that day, the first head of the OSS. So I would include Dulles in, because we're talking about the Kennedy assassination, et cetera. I would include the Dulles with the lawyer elite, which services the banking and industrial elite.
Yeah. Well, also Dulles also was a banker, but I reference,
Yes.
yeah, he was. But I want to come back for a minute to Jacques, but a whole sort of discussion that's clear here. Lyndon LaRouche was a target of these agencies, was almost killed by them in 1986, but was had to have his own personal security from 1974. And Jacques is very aware of arrangements and all kinds of organizing that we had to do in places like France whenever Lynn would travel. And I remember occasions where, especially in that period of the mid-'80s, we were in touch with Jim Garrison, who had investigated the Kennedy assassination. We were also assisting in some cases and helping him get things published in France. And I remember, Jacques, some discussions that Lynn had with some of the earlier members of the French resistance who had severe differences with Lynn on some occasions about the nature of these networks and the nature of the Assassination Bureau's relationship to later history. I'm bringing this up because the area that was most controversial, and this brings us back to Lumumba, was LaRouche's insistence on economic justice and development for what used to be called the Third World, meaning Africa, Asia, Ibero-America. We talked here about the Lumumba assassination. One of the things just to say is, if I'm not mistaken, there were approximately 6 or 7 native Africans, Congolese, who even had degrees, academic degrees in Congo in 1961. And to talk about this notion of, communist subversion was absurd. Of course, Kennedy had a certain intent with respect to some of these colonial areas, which was not realized. But I'm bringing this up, Jacques, I'm going to point this to you first, to say something to us about this relationship between economic development, the aspirations of people, for example, like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, and how these aspirations to throw off colonialism were being suppressed, sometimes murderously so, by factions that Kennedy found himself later to be opposed to, and may have played a role, or did play a role, in his own assassination.
Well, when you call for social justice, when you are against colonialism and you act accordingly, you are labeled a communist. That's the way in the Western nations they deal with it, and they try to convince people that you are such. I must add that the best trick of the devil is to make us believe that he doesn't exist. So you have this Henri Coston case that Cliff quoted. Coston is an interesting case of that. It's the types of people that are part of the truth to confuse other people. So Coston was in charge of Jewish affairs under Pétain's Vichy, under Darquier de Pellepoix, who was the one heading this business in Vichy. So he was among the group who would blame American plutocrats. Part of the Vichy people blamed American plutocrats from a synarchist point of view, and they tried to say that themselves was the enemies of finance. The National Socialist, Hitler, when he was rising to power, was blaming the financial capital. So all these people say these things, but they do the reverse. And we have to be very, very careful about that. And they say sometimes part of the truth. For example, Coston tried to say that he agreed with LaRouche, that he was with LaRouche, and so on and so forth. So you have to be very careful about these things. These people blame always de Gaulle because he was not a French patriot, because he wanted to give freedom to the French colonies. So he was not a French patriot. So it was all things on that. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second, which I think it's key, but I have no time to go into the details, but it's key. Allen Dulles was in Bern, Switzerland during World War II, heading on controlling the worst of the American secret services. He rather directly or not, but undoubtedly organized the murder of Jean Moulin, the head of the French resistance in continental France, delegated by Charles de Gaulle. Alan Dulles labeled him as a communist and had people in the French resistance who were opposed to the communists organizing the whole thing. Moulin was, in fact, the key connection between de Gaulle and the French humanist left, let's call it that way. A man that de Gaulle, France, and the world missed in 1945, and that we are all still missing now, because he could have been the connection between forces that were, let's say, on the Gaulle said there is no right, no left, there is a cause of France and the cause of humanity. So he said all the people of all the nations of the world and all the people deserve it, deserve development, common development. So, but that was possible because it was above the borders of dirty politics, what de Gaulle called le régime des partis. And Moulin being killed, de Gaulle had lost part of his free hand on the left, on the program of the resistance. And what could have been the party of the resistance in France was dismembered, disappeared, because the political will of somebody like Moulin was no more there. So I think if you look at all this story before us, and looking at him from my eyes in the 1960s, I could say that our mission is to make America good again, and France good again, and all the Western nations good again, to avoid today's consequences of these past murders and misdeeds. And this would lead, if it's still ignored, to the self-destruction of humanity. So it's the key to the present-day policy. It's not just an historical comment, it's here and now. This is what I wanted to say.
Yeah, okay. Robert Kennedy Jr. is running for president at this moment. While there has been an attempt to represent him as a so-called anti-vaxxer, what has been happening in the last, particularly 3 weeks, is that various matters have been raised by him, specifically the matter of Ukraine. We may refer to that a little later, and other policy questions. And what has occurred is this peculiar and kind of unique situation in the United States, where the past of this past 60 years since the assassination has suddenly converged upon the present in the form of this candidacy, but the candidacy addressing matters that are complete in such a way that are completely opposite to what the Biden administration, for example, is presently saying. What has happened now is that although Democratic and Republican parties don't really exist in the United States in the way that they used to, it appears from the standpoint, if you look from the bottom up, as though you now have an opposition to the Biden administration from within the Democratic Party being expressed by the candidacy specifically on the policy around Ukraine and around the policy concerning the need to have a peace settlement along the lines of the kind of thing that Helga Sepp-LaRouche has talked about in her principles, her 10 principles. No one has adopted the 10 principles among the candidates, but there's a discussion about the fact that the war needs to be concluded, particularly since it's been instigated from NATO. So I'd like to get a comment from both of you. First, you, Jacques, about what I don't know if you've heard some of these statements, but also what the situation is, you think, in terms of being able to allow that new kind of factional circumstance to go international, so to speak. And obviously, there's a question about the character of the United States, the role of the United States, the financing of the war by the United States, the Nord Stream pipeline question, all of these things. but there's also a question about how in the international community, not only these things are perceived, but what could be done to create a counterpole to the present policy. What do you think?
I think that Elga defining the 10th principle her 10th principle is key, that human beings are capable to be good, and to be good is their real sense of humanity. But they have to exert it. It's not to be imago viva Dei, if you look in religious terms, it's to be capax Dei, and to risk your life and your honor. As Kennedy said, we are all mortals, and we all want the goodness for our people, what's good for our people. So there is a matter of coincidence of the opposites, as Elga would put it. At the time, Kennedy said we hate communism, but we have the same human impulses, and what defines us is what's human beyond that, and we should avoid to destroy each other. So that was his American University speech. And I think it's key that on the June 10th, you are making of it an example for the future. And it's not known in Europe. Nobody knows it. My big fight, we had our Spring University for our party in France, Solidarité et Progrès, Solidarity and Progress, and people would say, but blame the United States, blame the United States. And they said, you are stupid, because all the countries now in our Western world are occupied countries. France is an occupied country culturally, economically, and socially. The United States also. So blame who is the true enemy, and look at it. And this is what we're discussing now. The true enemy is the ones that make the conditions or create the conditions for Kennedy to be killed. It's not mechanics. They don't say you kill Kennedy and it's you that would do it. It's something that creates, just Lynn said about Hinckley when he tried to kill Reagan. It's the same thing. They create an environment where these things would happen. And if you think in terms of security, we need an architecture of security and development for each nation and each person in the world. So if you look at it from that standpoint, you see that it's the environment that creates insecurity. It's not such and such thing, it's the environment. So we should change the environment. And that's the key challenge for us. And to make people understand that, like Lynn said once, you have to confront people at the same time in groups, in an audience, at the same time in a personal discussion, and an organizing discussion, to make the minds of these people suddenly to resonate with the importance of that they have. People with this society of screens, this society of fake culture, they have lost confidence in themselves. So if you instruct them about doing such and such things, it never works. You have to inspire them and to tell them you have something in you which makes you stupid in your common life. You can get rid of it very easily because you're human. Mm-hmm. And then it works. And it's the same, what we call in France is the Conseil National de la Résistance, where they have this agreement of all parties to have a policy of rebuilding the nation. It's the same for the Global South. And what I say here in France to the people who said, oh, France is no more important, or others said, oh, France is a great nation. So I said, look, if France wants to be a great nation, it has a seat, a permanent seat in the Security Council of the United States. It should represent the Global South. And de Gaulle did it, or tried to do it. He did not fully succeed, but he tried to do it. And that's why he was kicked out. So now let's do it. And it's much more important than in the 60s. It's even more important than at the Colombo Conference in 1976, where Lynn intervened through Fred Wills. It's now. And people, let's say, they see such horrors at this point that either they are mesmerized or they react. And the ones that tend to react now in France are top military who had responsibilities in the past, and they understand what's coming. And they said we should do something about it. People that understand it is trade unionists who are not entirely corrupted and who know that they have a social base that is demanding for something else than what's happening. And it's also people that have connections with the world, people that went to China, to the United States, to Russia, to Argentina, whatever. And these people understand that it's not French per se, that it's international. Same thing for the United States, it's no difference. And when I tell certain people the thing that most surprise them is that the life expectancy in the United States is below that of China today. And people have always this sense China is very developed, but at the same time, they mistreat the population, so on. So you tell them things like that, and people are like, oh, that's true. And that measures the danger of the situation, because if China and the United States fight, it's finished. So we have to stop that. And that people start to understand here, and I think also in the United States, there is this immediate potential, and we shouldn't be shy about it. And not to be shy, like Lynn was, never shy, never shying from saying the truth. Then that's what we have to do at this point. And when you are threatened, either you have the alternative to be dead or the alternative to have organized and changed the situation. And I think if people are understanding it and in the process of understanding this, I'm deeply convinced. And to reveal things like they happened in the past, how bad people could be a danger if you don't introduce this potential for the good and the opportunity that you have now. This is only probably part of the answer, but I think it's key in terms of, at the same time, being truthful, then very demanding, and people would not like that at the first time, but at the same time, respecting that they have the potential to be also truthful.
Right. Cliff, let me ask you your thoughts both on what Jacques just said, as well as in the present circumstance, the use of the American University speech of JFK, June 10th, to counter the crazy policies coming out of Washington by a positive image of a president acting as a president and on behalf of precisely the policy that should be adopted now.
Well, absolutely, Dennis. President Kennedy, just like, for example, President Eisenhower or President in particular, Franklin Roosevelt, behaved as presidents of a sovereign country with their national interest involved, as well as their concern for international affairs and the well-being of mankind. And Kennedy made various statements and speeches about that, and he was favorable to the rise of nationalism in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of our political parties and Ukraine, our two parties both have factions within them. You have the Hawk faction, and you have other factions who are increasingly anti-war, actually, which is a good thing to see. So both the Republicans and the Democrats have factions within them, and it would be good to try to align the different factions who are anti-war in both parties, and independents as well, of course, align that. And certainly Robert Kennedy, in his statements about Ukraine, which actually surprised me. I didn't realize that he was that up to date on international affairs, foreign affairs. I had thought, as you pointed out, that he was mostly concerned with medical issues and children's health and things along those lines. And I did not know that he was so well informed about the Ukraine issue and international politics. That was a very welcome surprise. The Ukraine issue, we can look at also from a globalist point of view. Two objectives the globalists have: one, to challenge Russia, to contain Russia, etc., and two, to control the very rich natural resources in Ukraine and industrial resources in Ukraine. They have, magnificent agriculture, wheat, and all sorts of agricultural products. And in the eastern portion of Ukraine, they have had a very, very developed industrial structures, so capacity. And they also have natural gas capacities and coal. So Ukraine is very resource rich, just like the Belgian Congo was resource rich, not only with uranium, but a lot of other minerals, et cetera, et cetera. So on the Ukraine side of things, the globalists are, and their supporters in the United States, the factions like the neoconservatives, the Cold War hawks, the humanitarian interventionists, all these different foreign policy networks, they're all interventionist and they're all pro-war, pro-Ukraine war. Now, the danger here that Jacques pointed out is that we could engage in war with China, that this would be the war in Ukraine would be a stepping stone to war in Asia against China. And the pretext there is so-called Taiwan Island, which has been a part of China for 400 years. But the Washington hawks and various assorted delusional crazies are trying to use the so-called Taiwan issue like the Ukraine issue. Let's go to war against Russia using Ukraine as a proxy. Let's go to war against China using Taiwan as a proxy. So, and now you have the spectacle of at the G7 in Hiroshima, the spectacle of Japan rearming, and although it's been rearming for quite a long time, now they're just more open about it. And Germany rearming. I mean, what's going on here? We've got the Western elites, the globalist elites, rearming Japan and Germany. What is this all about? Are we going to go for World War III here? Is that what they're planning? So I think these concerns are not just speculation or conspiracy theory. These are very real concerns, the hawks. So I would say we need to support the doves in both parties. We need something like an anti-war movement that we had in the anti-Vietnam War days, where you had a range of people and organizations who were against the Vietnam War, many on the left, some in the center, some on the right, but everybody was focused against the Vietnam War. Same thing needs to be done here with Ukraine, but it's not just ending the war, it's also establishing a new security architecture for Europe and new global understandings where we're going to have, as Jacques pointed out, peace through development. And the 10 principles that Helga raised are very constructive, and people should bear those in mind when we're thinking about international relations today and the severe crisis that we're in. And it appears the crisis is going to deepen before it gets any better.
Yeah, we're coming to the end, but we had one question that came in actually from Jose, which I want to ask you. This is an historical question, and then we are trying to locate some of the remarks of RFK on Ukraine. But the question that he asked was about Dag Hammarskjöld. They said Dag Hammarskjöld also died in 1961. Was that an assassination attempt too, or was that never really proven? That's the question. Either one of you would like to take that? Jacques?
Cliff.
Okay.
Well, my understanding is he was assassinated. And I don't know all the details, but I believe wasn't there a plane crash, et cetera, and all this sort of thing. So I think back in the day, people also thought he was assassinated. And again, he was trying for global understanding and peace. And here you have another example of an assassination.
Okay. We're going to just wait for a minute to see if Jose can. This is not a problem because we're going to edit all of this just so people understand. Oh, actually, we can take a break for a moment and just ask the question, what else do we want to emphasize or questions? I'm going to leave the Vietnam thing alone. We don't have to do that. Is there anything that we should or want to emphasize more at this point? Stress more?
Well, in my view, I'm very concerned about the hysteria, the pro-war hysteria in Washington. The politicians are just off the deep end when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, China. And the other thing I'm concerned about in Europe is that the European leaders, such as they are following right along in this not just American-led. It's a synergy-led proposition here, a globalist-led, transatlantic, oligarchy-led globalism that's confrontational, and this definitely could break out into a third world war, either in Europe or in the Pacific, or both.
Oh, well, here's what we should do. I just realized I had not put this together. And our director said both of you. Well, we have Lula of Brazil, we have Ramaphosa of South Africa, along with other African nations. We have potentially maybe even something coming out of Denmark at the moment, and certainly China, who have put clear alternative peace proposals into play. There's also, of course, the Vatican, which has been involved in this for some time. Now these are there. At the same time, clearly, London and Washington have stated, and they've caused the mouthpiece Zelensky to state, no way, we're not going to do this. But at the same time, it's pretty clear, increasingly clear, and you see this in statements from in the London Spectator, the Telegraph, even the Economist, that British finance recognizes that the sanctions policy has failed against Russia, and that the attempt to contain Russia in that regard, the so-called financial nuclear war that I think French Finance Minister Bruno De La Mare talked about back in March and April of 2022. That's not going to work. Nothing's going to go anywhere with that. So in that environment, the Kennedy American University speech, which keeps making that point that there's one planet, we share the same air, want the same thing for our children, and we are all mortal, as he put it, has a resonance, and is even being used, I would say, by some pro-peace factions or anti-war factions in the United States right now. Okay, now, Jacques, let me ask you first, what's your sense of what would have to happen, not merely in Europe, but what would have to happen for the forces or the array of forces that are now moving for peace to get real traction in the transatlantic world, or in that is in France, Germany, Italy, nations like that? And Cliff, I'm going to ask you about the same thing with respect to both the United States and the transatlantic world. But I just wanted to have a sense, where do we go from here? We're having this today, well, this will be, of course, on tomorrow, or rather the day after tomorrow. So, Jacques.
Well, in a sense, the paradox, and it's not so much of a paradox, is that the forces that have a sense of that something has to be done to get out of the trap are military who know the consequences of war. They're not like civilians. They know that if you go into a war, there are murders, there are horrors. They are speaking about horrors in Ukraine. It's a horrible war. It's like World War I. It's horrible. It's the trenches, it's artillery, it's horrible. So people say, oh, it's terrible. Who should we blame? No, the approach to blame is wrong at that point. The approach is to do good, to exclude those that are accomplices of this deadly, let's say, politics. The good thing with Robert Kennedy is that he breaks through the rules of the game. And that's a good beginning. But now we have to create the conditions where he would fight for peace. Here we have, besides the military, we have all the old communists, not the new types who are totally involved in counterculture, but the old communists, not only people who have been active in East Germany, but people that have been active in France, the veteran communists in the networks of veterans. These veterans networks were organized mainly by communists or communists. They are responding very positively to what we are doing. There are people, Christian, the true Christians who are not necessarily Catholics. We have to you have to create again the conception of Christianity in Protestant, in Catholics, or in others, or Judaism among the Jews. We have to recreate the basis, the right basis for the good things that they did and they accomplished in world history. So we have all that coming together in a confused way, like the countries of the global South come in a confused way. It's not a clear-cut thing, but it's something that it's, let's say, in such a frame of mind that they are looking for things that could make them of a one. We have to sense that this multipolar world can becoming one world concerned, if it's concerned, to something that is good in common. I think that's the main challenge. And let's forget about the leftovers of World War I. In fact, Ukraine and Taiwan are leftovers of World War II, sorry. And let's not think anymore about the past. Let's define what we need for the future. And let's create the conditions for peace to fight against the war, but fight against the war is not enough. We have to give people a sense of what we can do with peace and how this peace is based on common development. And I would say, I would add creative goodness, a sense of creative goodness. And in that sense, the American University speech of Kennedy, the June 10 American University speech, is really giving this sense of creative goodness. And for that, it should be an example for today, in that sense.
Yeah. Cliff, we found the Ukraine section of discussion, and I think what we're going to do is play that for you. So, because you had not seen it, not been aware of what Kennedy had said. I believe this is from an interview he did approximately 9 days ago with Russell Brand on his particular blog. I think there's an opening question, and then he responds, and I'll have you respond to that.
So firstly, yeah, is it a humanitarian war? What's going on with the expenditure? How do you end these wars? What's going to be the impact of the escalating tensions between the US and Russia, and of course the agitation of China through the semiconductor Taiwan gear?
Well, we were sold on the fact that it was a humanitarian war, and we were sold using these kind of formulaic narratives that, Putin is the evil Hitler-like figure, or Saddam Hussein, whoever it is, the one that we need to go to war, and that we are the good guys, and that it's a humanitarian war. But we have not been acting like it's a humanitarian one. And by the way, my own son went over there and was fighting over there. He fought, he was a machine gunner in a special forces unit. He joined the Foreign Legion and fought in the Kharkiv offensive, motivated by those impulses, by the humanitarian impulse, by the courage of the Ukrainian people, by the brutality of the Russian invasion, etc. And but if you look at the history of why, what's happened over there, and you go back a little bit in history, in 1990-91, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, we made a deal with Gorbachev, Britain and the United States, and it was over the reunification, which is a very dicey issue of Germany, because the Russians had 400,000 troops in East Germany. And we wanted to reunite East Germany under NATO, which had been the Russian enemy. So the Russians were naturally worried and said, if we take our troops out, we want to make sure that you're not getting a beachhead and you're not going to move NATO into all of our, former satellite states and make us feel like we're under attack, like we're being encircled. And President Bush famously told them, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, since then, we've moved it 1,000 miles to the east, and we've incorporated 14 of the Russian former satellite states, and we've put nuclear missile capable systems, the Aegis missile system, which is manufactured by Lockheed, in both Romania and Poland. And the Russians were terrified we'd put that in Ukraine, which is only 400 miles from Russia. And they repeatedly said to us, you cannot incorporate Ukraine into NATO. We then unilaterally walked away from our 2 intermediate nuclear weapons treaties with Russia. So we had treaties saying you can't use intermediate nuclear weapons. These were huge steps in progress, and we canceled both of them unilaterally. We told the Russians we're not doing that anymore. Surrounding these missile systems, we started practicing, incorporating Ukraine into interoperability with NATO forces. Zelensky runs in 2019. We helped to overthrow the democratically elected government of the Ukraine in 2014 and install a very ultra-nationalist, and that is a polite way of describing them, ultra-nationalist, government there that's extremely anti-Russian. That prompts the Russians to go in and invade Crimea because they're terrified that now that we have our own government in place there, we're going to put the naval of our U.S. Navy fleet in a warm water port that they've had for, I think, 370 years. It's their only warm water port. It's their way of, having a military presence in the Black Sea. They're terrified we're going to go in there, so they invade Crimea. Then the new Russian government comes in and enacts all of these oppressive laws against the ethnic Russian majority in eastern Ukraine. 80% of the people in the Donbass are ethnic Russians, and they were able to have their own language, and they felt part of the Ukraine. But suddenly, there's all these laws being passed saying, that language is no longer any good. You have to speak Ukrainian, and treated essentially as redheaded stepchildren. And they start doing protests, and the government then reacts violently, and you basically have a civil war in which 14,000 ethnic Russians are killed. Put yourself in our position. I was here in 1962 when the Russians put nuclear missile sites in Cuba, and we were ready to invade, even though we didn't even know they had that they were armed at that point. And if they had also, if Mexico did that, we'd be in there in a second. If Mexico started killing American expatriates, 14,000 of them, we'd invade in a second. So we have a Monroe Doctrine, and we've been forced for hundreds of years that says no other major power can put any military equipment in our hemisphere. Meanwhile, we've never been invaded. The Russians have been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time they were invaded during World War II, they were invaded through the Ukraine. 1 out of every 7 Russians was killed, 13% of the population. Russia was leveled. My uncle in 1963 gave his most important speech, the American University speech. And that speech, he tried to do what I'm doing right now. He told America, it was a speech to the American people, you got to put yourself in the shoes of the Russians and understand how they have a worldview. You have to put yourself in the shoes of your adversary. And he went through this history of the suffering that Russia had endured during World War II and explaining why it would want to have a legitimate claim to protect its borders. And the U.S., the Ukraine today is a victim of U.S. aggression as well, because Zelensky ran in 2019 here's a guy who's a comedian and an actor, and I'm not saying that in a disparaging way, Russell, please. I don't want you to hear that in a disparaging way. He's a comedian. He's a comedian. And
I run Europe, could work.
The reason I'm saying that is the only reason he won that election is he ran on a peace platform. He was going to ratify the Minsk Accords, which was the Russian-supported agreement. Donbass remains part of Ukraine, even though it had voted to join Russia. Russia said, we don't want them to stay in Ukraine, but you need to protect them. You need to make them semi-autonomous so they're not getting killed. And Zelensky then gets in there. He gets surrounded by U.S. neocons, including most prominently Victoria Nuland. And she's the one who sort of orchestrated the U.S. walking away from all these nuclear treaties, and all of his peace professions suddenly disappear. And he is pressured by ultranationalists within Ukraine and by the U.S. government to start having a military response instead of going to the table with the Russians. And now we've pumped 113 million in there. It's a proxy war, and our government has admitted, President Biden has admitted that this is, the old neocon aspiration. This war is about getting rid of Putin. And his Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, acknowledged in April 2022 that the war is about the U.S. purpose of engaging this war is to exhaust and degrade the Russian army so they're incapable of fighting anywhere else in the world. So that is our objective in this war. And it is a proxy war that is using the bodies of the flower of Ukrainian youth, putting them into an abattoir where they are being mercilessly killed. They aren't even admitting this. The Pentagon doesn't admit it. The Ukrainian government doesn't admit it. They have lost more than 300,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Ukrainians are trying to leave Ukraine, and it is now illegal to leave Ukraine if you're, below 55 years of age and a male. It is, and they've killed 14,000 civilians. It's 60% unemployment. The infrastructure of the country has been destroyed for U.S. geopolitical machinations, and it's not right. The Russians are killing Ukrainians at a rate of probably around 7-1, as they have a 10-1 artillery advantage. And we've killed between 30,000 and 100,000 Russians, which isn't something to be happy about either. None of this is stuff that we should be doing if we really wanted peace. But this is a war where Ukraine has been made a victim, not just by Russia, but by the United States government.
Okay. So, Cliff?
Well, the remarks by Robert Kennedy Jr. indicate that he's very familiar with the Ukraine situation and very realistic about it. I would just say a few things here. First, we need to remember the historical context here. Ukraine is a fake country that was created in 1918 during World War I by the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, launched by the German General Staff and supported by Lenin. And so this was an agreement to create this fake country between the German General Staff and the Bolsheviks, so the Bolsheviks could hold on to power in Russia, etc., and the Germans could swing west to that front and move away from the Russian front. Just like Ukraine is a fake country, we saw what happened to Yugoslavia, created after World War I, a fake country. It broke apart in recent years. We saw the same thing with Czechoslovakia. It broke apart. The ethnical minorities, etc., created centrifugal forces. These countries were put together, cobbled together in World War I, but had no basis to be cobbled together. So Yugoslavia broke up, Czechoslovakia broke up, and certainly Ukraine, coming to today, there's not going to be much left of Ukraine. That remains to be seen. The Russians have regained Crimea. The Russians have regained the Donbass in the eastern portion of Ukraine. The old Novorossiya of the old Russian Tsarist Empire went all the way over to Odessa. Maybe the Russians won't go that far this time, but Russia already has regained a substantial portion of Ukraine. This means that Ukraine has already been partitioned, just like Poland was once partitioned. Although Poland regained, Ukraine is not going to regain its territory. So you have the de facto partition of Ukraine right now. The question in Ukraine is, how much further are the Russians going to advance before there is a peace settlement? Now, and discussion, diplomacy and a peace settlement following diplomacy. Let me point out that in World War I, diplomacy was blocked by Paris and London. There were peace initiatives in 1916 and 1917 and 1918. The most famous one was by the Austrian Emperor Karl, but there were other ones, French and other, and Belgian and other initiatives, Spanish. The key, Jacques will remember, Mr. Ribot in France was the key person that wanted to continue the war against Germany. So, and in England, there was another group that wanted to continue the war. The point I'm making is that the same thing has happened now. Instead of trying to promote peace like the Pope did in World War I and others did in World War I, the opponents of peace, the war hawks, the warmongers, have rallied, just like they did in London and Paris for World War I. They rallied today. And just as Dennis, you pointed out, the U.S. objective, and Mr. Kennedy pointed out, the U.S. objective is to so-called bleed Russia, weaken Russia. The same token, use Taiwan to bleed China. But so on the Ukraine side, we must insist on peace, on diplomacy that can lead to peace. So you have a diplomatic process that leads to peace. Those diplomatic processes have been blocked since 2014. The Minsk peace process was fake. Merkel admitted it. So did Hollande. It was a fake diplomacy on the part of the West that tricked Russia into thinking that everything was okay. So what do? I think two levels. One, we need to think in terms of international united front among all people around the world, countries that are come together on a united front basis for peace and development. Within the United States, we need to make a popular front among the various political parties and factions of the political parties that are willing to be pro-peace. So we have a new MOB like we did in the anti-war movement in Vietnam. We mobilize people and mobilize the different people who are pro-peace rather than pro-war. Well, that would be my quick reaction. I think Robert Kennedy was absolutely correct in his assessment and his recommendation for peace.
Yeah, Jacques, your response and also final thoughts from you. Both. You may have a response to what you heard, and then anything you'd like to say in conclusion.
Well, to make people understand the situation, if you look at a human individual, thou should not kill. But there are cases where legally, in cases of self-defense, we are threatened by death, you may defend yourself, and you have to if you want to survive. It's the same for Ukraine and for Putin. The fundamental interests of Russia as a state were threatened. So he had no other choice than to intervene because it was provoked. It doesn't mean that we should take sides in such a war. We should take sides from above because it's the only possibility to solve the Ukrainian crisis. It cannot be solved as such, I'm convinced. Everybody knows on a book or on a paper the solution, which would be a fair sharing of the land, a guarantee of the new borders, neutrality for Ukraine, not belonging to NATO, not belonging to the European Union, but being involved in a process of reconstruction by both sides. So this cannot take place as such today. It can only take place from above. If we decide that with China, and other countries, the countries that were mentioned, the global south, the global majority, we create the conditions that in a new context, with a new environment, with a new architecture of security and common development, we can create the conditions for peace in Ukraine. So the two are combined, and it's at a higher level only that things could be solved. And this is what we are doing in the Schiller Institute. I think the Schiller Institute is in our next meeting that we will have in Strasbourg. We are trying to look how a real autonomy in Europe, we should stop to being the stuffed turkeys in Europe. We should be with a real autonomy, and this autonomy should not be against anybody. It should be for the future and a commitment for the future. And I think that probably you don't realize it, but at this point, the relations between France and Germany are very bad. Between France and Italy, they are bad. There is not a unified United States of Europe. There is a disunified or non-unified states of Europe. So at this point, to bring together a higher order would be the only way to avoid an explosion of everything, of the world, of Europe, of probably even inside the United States. So that's the interest of the United States. Certainly all these people in the Hoover Institution and in Jamestown who are planning the disintegration of Russia are insane. And I hope that there will be a sense of sanity, at least in the American Congress or the American presidency, to avoid it. So that's the sense of a unity for the future beyond the present leftovers of World War II. World War I and World War II ended in a way that the conditions for a next war were more or less doomed. It could be there. The potential for that was there. So we should solve it this day forever. And this would mean to get rid of the British imperial conception of the world. And it's the only way. If you don't do that, there won't be peace in Ukraine. And it has become, unfortunately, Anglo-American and with extended to all, at this point, Western nations. So that's a real danger for the whole world. And it's understood in the South. What people in France are saying, we should try to be friends of the South and staying into NATO and staying with the oligarchy because it cannot be fought. This is false. It's a fallacy of composition, and it could not work. So the only thing would be to see, I call it to see with the eyes of the future, and not with the old eyes of the world wars and the old eyes of, let's say, oligarchical thinking. We should think in terms of everything we did to organize the world wars in the 20th century. We should organize to create the conditions for peace in the 21st century. And that's a big challenge.
Okay, very good. All right. Anything that either of you would like to add first, Cliff? Anything at all?
Well, I totally agree with Jacques and his last comments, and I wish the Schiller Institute well in their upcoming conference to promote, as I mentioned before, sort of an international solidarity here for peace and development, and to promote diplomacy. There's no substitute for diplomacy with respect to the Ukraine issue or any of these major international issues. We need to strengthen the UN and reform it, of course, but in the immediate future, we need a diplomacy. We can't get to a peace solution or a peace conference or a peace settlement on the Ukraine issue unless we start diplomacy. We have to have diplomacy started. But as I mentioned before, the British, the Americans, etc., have been blocking diplomacy on the Ukraine issue. Thus, other countries, China and Brazil, etc., other countries in the world need to get together and with the Pope, etc., and promote a diplomatic process. Because without a diplomatic process, we're never going to get to a peace settlement. So we have to promote that process as soon as possible. And of course, coming back to our Synarchy theme, that the globalists do not want peace. The globalists are making plenty of money off of this Ukraine situation, and will, they think, in the Asian war. So we're back to the issue of who's blocking peace. Well, the globalists are blocking peace. Okay.
Jacques, thank you. Jacques, any final message to your friends in America?
Well, I would repeat what Edgar says. Citizens of the world unite. And the Americans should think that they are not only Americans, like Lynn always was. They are citizens, like Lynn always was, citizens of the world, and think in terms of the world, and think in terms of what, with the eyes of the other, what people see from Russia, from China, from the global South, from Europe. And if that sense is developed in the population, I am very optimistic. I think that the solution is possible. And what's latent in the good side of American history could become true and possible. But for that, you need many of you like you are, many liancers, many of all of you are, Cliff and you and others, to make a good job. And it demands, as Lyndon LaRouche always said, to work, and to work.
Yes, and also to have fun.
And fun, working,
Have
of
fun.
course. That's the fun of the work.
Be mischievous.
All right, thanks a lot.